It's Human Trafficking Week this week. Tonight we're looking at the prevalence of human trafficking in South Africa. How many cases are prosecuted annually? Would a tightening of the law deter trafficking syndicates? Joining us is Dr. Marcel van der Walt from UNISA's Department of Police Practice, also with the National Freedom Network. Dr. van der Walt, good evening to you. There's so many scare stories. You spend 2 minutes on Twitter. You're going to see all kinds of things on this. There are many claims around human trafficking. At the same time, it is a serious problem. How difficult is it to work out how big the problem is in South Africa?
So, Stephen, the very nature of the crime does not lend itself to be easily counted. Many victims don't consider themselves victims. Many people submit to exploitation because of a position of vulnerability. Working with human trafficking for the last 18 years, I can state unequivocally, it's an intractable and a systemic problem. The numbers doesn't always match with the narratives and the sensationalist claims out there. But it is a problem, and, I think, governments, unfortunately, also be notoriously poor with record keeping. A lot of these cases are subsumed under a variety of other crimes, kidnapping, rape, abduction, etc. So is it a reality? Absolutely. And does the statistics match that? Realities, unfortunately not.
Who is vulnerable to this? Is it young children, or is it primarily young women? And that then takes us straight with links to what I suppose, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll call the sex trade.
Well, anybody is vulnerable. I mean, some of the victims I've worked with, Stephen, dating back to the mid-2000s, was a psychologist, a social worker, the wife of a policeman. And I always use the example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right at the bottom, you've got physiological needs that needs to be met, and that's exploited by traffickers. Right on top, you've got the need for self-actualization, and that's where people who are more affluent could fall victim to this crime. So men, women, and children, boys, anybody and everybody can fall victim to this crime.
Then what's the psychologist used for if they're human trafficked? I mean, the wife of a police officer, this would someone who would know. I mean, what happens to them?
Yeah, well, that's the assumption. I mean, so obviously there is. I can use an example. A few years ago, some colleagues responded to an invitation for a conference, a United Nations conference in New York. And at the end of the day, we picked up, the earliest one was in 2007. We picked up, it was a West African syndicate recruiting people in North America. So again, it's a lie. Sometimes it's just too good to be true. People sign up. Travel documents fraudulently obtained that comes across as legit, and people fall in traps, and there are countless examples like that.
Is there a strong link between, prostitution, sex work, the sex trade, and human trafficking? Is that what sort of drives it? I mean, that's the common perception.
Well, the first question you ask is, what are people trafficked for? I mean, one of the most documented types of trafficking is sex trafficking, right? So I think you need to be careful not to conflate, first and foremost, prostitution and human trafficking. Our legislation, we've definitely got one of the best legislations in the world, unequivocally, and the legislation clearly delineates between the two. But obviously, sex trafficking is the most documented type of trafficking globally, and we see it in South Africa as well. I mean, there's a lot of researchers, unfortunately, advocacy groups, unfortunately, who continues to dismiss this issue. The research that is being done by some of these groups are highly questionable, truncating the definition, using wrong definitions, and effectively undercounting the prevalence of this issue in the sex trade. When I testify in the courts, you really see how systemic this is in the sex trade. Once you understand the transcripts and testimony in court cases, you realize it is a problem, and it cannot be placated or dismissed.
Okay, if we decriminalize sex work, and there's a conversation around that at the moment, would that make a difference?
Well, you do realize, Stephen, that's a very controversial issue at the moment. So I'm going to give you a perspective from an organized crime police investigator, and this is my experience. I mean, at the end of the day, men will not buy if pimps and traffickers doesn't sell. That could come across an oversimplification. But, I mean, then you need to understand, I mean, people throw around decriminalization. What do we actually mean? There's various forms of legislation. I think what the lobby groups don't do, they don't actually tell you what they mean by decriminalization, because there's two types of decriminalization. The first part is partial decriminalization, where the person in prostitution is decriminalized, but the buyers continue to be prosecuted. That is what's referred to as the equality of the Nordic model. The other part of it, which is greatly concerning, is full decriminalization, where effectively brothels are going to become legal, and where the buying, the selling, all types of activities together with that effectively becomes legal. So we need to understand, what do we talk about when we speak about decriminalization? And unfortunately, the issue is often obfuscated and leaves people with more questions than answers in terms of what are we actually talking about when we talk about decriminalization.
Dr. Marcel van der Walt, thank you, from the National Freedom Network, also at UNISA's Department of Police Practice.